Hey guys, this is Clinton Jeff from UnleashedPhones.com, and today I'm going to talk to you about the brand new 2014 Moto G. Now earlier this year, Motorola made a huge comeback over at my side of the world when they launched the Moto G, the Moto E and the Moto X all in India. But this happened earlier this year when there was no real competition for the Moto G. Because of the combination of an affordable price tag, pure Android and decent performance, the Moto G did really well over here earlier this year. This year's version has a larger screen and a couple hardware upgrades, but not too much, but still keeps the same price tag. Here's what I think of the 2014 Moto G. Alright, in terms of design, the Moto G looks pretty much exactly like what you'd see with last year's version. There's the same subtle curve at the back, the same button placements, and a cute little dimple at the back where the Motorola logo is placed. For an entry-level smartphone, it's a pretty okay, nice enough design. But the biggest difference that you'll notice in this year's version is how much larger it is. Last year's Moto G was really easy to use because of its size. This year's Moto G measures 141 by 70 by 11 millimeters and weighs in at 149 grams, which makes it kind of as large as the new Moto X. While the size might mean that it's not as comfortable to use as last year's version, the Moto G is still easier to use than most of today's gigantic screen phones. Constructed out of the same plastic build quality as last year's version, the Moto G feels slightly more premium but nowhere as solid as the new Moto X. There's also the same level of customization available because the Moto G does have replaceable back panels, so you can buy a pink or blue back panel in case you don't like the black or white versions that the Moto G comes in. Of course, this does depend on region because you might not be able to get every single color wherever you are. As you can tell, once again, I got the boring black version to review. I feel like this is going to be a trend for my reviews from now onwards. At the front, there's a large 5-inch 720p resolution IPS LCD that equals about 294 ppi pixel density, which is pretty decent. That might not be incredibly high resolution, but it's still effective enough that you can easily read text or make out fine details in your web browser. In terms of quality, the IPS display used on the new Moto G doesn't have as great viewing angles as the Moto X does with its AMOLED screen, but it still does a really good job at accurate color reproduction, and it's also more usable outdoors in sunlight. You might still need to shield the screen to see it properly in direct sunlight though. Overall, I would say the screen is pretty decent for something at this price range. Above the display, there's the centrally located earpiece, which also happens to be the top loudspeaker. There's a front-facing 2 megapixel camera. There's also an LED notification light and an ambient light sensor hidden somewhere inside there. Below the display, there's no capacitive touch keys at all because the Moto G uses on-screen navigation controls, which is pretty awesome. You will see that there is a loudspeaker grill at the bottom though. Yes, indeed, the new Moto G sports dual front-facing speakers, which is pretty awesome and kind of the same thing that HTC does with their boom sound speakers. But the quality of these front-facing speakers isn't anywhere close to HTC's boom sound speakers. It's also funny to see stereo front-facing speakers on the Moto G because the more expensive Moto X does not have that feature. Coming to the phone itself, on the left side there's no buttons or keys, keeping it very minimalistic. At the bottom you'll just have the lone micro USB charging and connectivity port. On the right side you'll see the volume rocker key and the screen lock aka power button, while at the top you'll just see the lone 3.5mm audio jack with a tiny pinhole for the secondary noise cancellation microphone. Coming to the back, there's just the camera module and a single LED flash with a Motorola dimple at the back. Of course, this back panel is removable and it's pretty easy to take it off. You just clip it off right over here. Once you clip it off, you will get access to the SIM card slots, which are 1 and 2 right over here, and the micro SD card slot. As you probably guessed by now, the Moto G is available in single SIM and dual SIM versions. This is a dual SIM version. Unfortunately, neither version allows you to get to that non-replaceable battery though. All in all, I think the design of the new Moto G is pretty nice enough. It is very similar to last year's version though, but at least you can buy replaceable colored back panels so that you can make it look more your style. Alright, coming to hardware, you'd think with a newer phone, Motorola would have put better specs in there. But unfortunately, the new Moto G uses exactly the same processor as last year's Moto G. Yes indeed, Motorola has gone with the same quad-core 1.2 GHz Qualcomm Snapdragon 400 processor, but there's also 1 GB of RAM and an Adreno 305 GPU. We've also seen this processor on the HTC Desire A16, which costs a lot more than the Moto G. This processor can handle basic operations pretty well, but throw any really intensive task at it and you will see a couple drop frames. In case you're really into benchmark results, you can check out my blog post over on UnleashedPhones.com for proper benchmark scores. All in all, it's safe to say that the Moto G's processor is decent enough for day-to-day activities, but you might not be able to play very intense games on it. Apart from that, you get the Moto G in both 8GB and 16GB few versions. Again, this also depends on the region that you're buying it from. In terms of connectivity, there's no 4G or NFC unfortunately, but there is Bluetooth, Wi-Fi and a GPS. Coming to software, as you'd expect, the new Moto G runs a vanilla version of Android 4.4.4 KitKat, which is currently the latest version of that operating system available. Just like last year's version, there's no custom UI on top, so it's basic Android, just as Google intended it to be used. And Motorola has delivered a pure Google experience with no competing services pre-installed at all. Another advantage to it running stock Android is that Motorola has guaranteed an upgrade to Android L whenever that comes along. All the stable Google apps are available and everything's exactly as you'd expect it to be, so I'm not going to go over the UI again. It's exactly the same as the Nexus 5 that I reviewed earlier. There are a couple of Motorola related things though, because they have some of their own apps installed just to enhance the user experience a slight bit. There's Motorola Alert, Motorola Assist, Motorola Connect and Motorola Migrate. There's nothing really new about any of these services, but they are all available on the phone. I've actually talked about them before with last year's Moto G and Moto X, so I'm not going to go into detail again about those services because I'm trying to keep this video slightly short. But in case you need to know more information about those services, you can check out the blog post or unleashedphones.com. Coming to messaging, there's the stock Android keyboard, which works well enough and is very spacious and very responsive on that screen, so it's really easy to type long messages and it's very comfortable as well. Similarly, if you want to surf the internets, there's Google's Chrome browser, which also works very well and looks really nice. While it might not be super high resolution, websites still look great on that 5-inch 720p display, though that processor might mean that it might not be the smoothest in terms of kinetic scrolling. Zooming and panning around websites is still quick enough. In terms of multimedia, there's the Google Play Music app, which does a pretty okay job in terms of playing both onboard music and streaming music as well. The dual front-facing speakers might not be as great as HTC's boom sound level of quality, but they do output 74 decibels of audio, which isn't super loud but is still audible enough. It's actually kind of equal to the sound quality out of the single speaker of the Moto X. Generally speaking, quality from the loudspeakers and wire headphones is still pleasant enough. Apart from that, to handle video, there's the Google Play Store where you can download movies to watch, but you can also play back almost any type of video format that you put on the Moto G. Videos look great on that 720p 5-inch screen. Coming to the camera, the new Moto G sports a higher resolution 8 megapixel f2.0 aperture lens at the back, while at the front you have a also higher resolution 2 megapixel front-facing camera. The camera UI is pretty much exactly the same as last year's version of the Moto G. There are absolutely no manual controls at all, but there are a couple scene modes. For example, you can switch to the HDR mode, there's also a panorama mode, or you can just switch to the video mode, and there's also the ability to record in slow motion video as well. That being said, video can only be recorded at up to 720p resolution, which isn't super great, but isn't too bad either. In terms of camera quality, as long as lighting is decent enough, camera quality is pretty good. Images taken in outdoor sunny scenarios all had good detail with a natural amount of color reproduction and proper exposure. In low lighting situations, images tend to have a lot more noise and subdued details. You also get a lot of blurry images unless you keep your hand very steady. The single LED flash at the back does a good enough job for portrait pictures, but I should also note that the camera app takes about a second longer to take a picture compared to last year's Moto G. As always, I have a whole bunch of camera samples and video samples over on the blog that you can check out right over at unleashedphones.com. Moving on to call quality. Call quality out of the Moto G is pretty average. For the most part, it's easy enough to comprehend what people are saying on this side of the phone call. Though that being said, there's a slight amount of distortion and voices can be a little muffled overall. But on the flip side, on the other end of the calls, everyone said that they could hear my voice very clear. Coming to battery life, the Moto G shares another similarity with last year's version of the Moto G, and that is that it has the same 2070 mAh battery. That battery lasts for about a day's worth of normal usage. If you're a power user, you probably need to charge this up before you leave from work for the evening. I was able to get about 6 hours worth of continuous video playback from the Moto G. All in all, battery life on the new Moto G isn't too bad, but isn't too great either. Alright, to conclude, the new Moto G is pretty much catered to exactly the same target audience as last year's Moto G. I gotta hand it to Motorola for making these small improvements while still keeping the price tag the same. But that being said, last year there were no comparable Android devices to compete with the Moto G, and this year it has a lot more competition from the likes of the cheaper Android One devices, and then there's Xiaomi, which has real value for money devices, and there's also a bunch of Windows phones like the Lumia 730, which is almost the same price as the Moto G. Out of all of these phones, the only real competition is the Xiaomi Redmi 1S, which costs half the price of the Moto G, but it's really hard to get your hands on. At the end of the day, the Moto G remains to be a simple, pure Android phone without any bloatware that looks and feels great and offers a slight amount of customizability thanks to those replaceable back panels. If you're on a budget and looking for something basic that's more or less lag-free, and you don't want to jump through the hoops required to get a Xiaomi phone, the Moto G seems like a formidable option to check out right now. So that's what I think about the new Moto G, guys. As always, if you have any questions, you can let me know right in the comment section below, or check out the blog post over at unleashedphones.com for a better, more detailed write-up. And as always, if you like this video, maybe hit like, maybe hit the subscribe button, because that would be appreciated. And that's about it. Thanks for watching, guys.